Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 194 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. The FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report is sponsored by Advanced Compliance Solutions, who this week is offering my first FCPA Masterclass training. FCPA Masterclass is the ultimate nuts and bolts compliance program course. It is being offered on September 10th and 11th in Houston, Texas. I have a few slots available. If you'd like some more information, please contact me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. But today, in this episode, you are in for a real treat because I have back with me Maurice Gilbert. Maurice is the principal of Concilium, one of the country's top compliance and chief compliance officer search organizations. Maurice continues in part 2 of his 3-part series on hiring in compliance. Today he talks about the work that he and Concilium do to source candidates for companies who are looking for a chief compliance officer and compliance practitioner, and the presentation of the offer to potential candidates to get them interested. The episode comes in at just under 22 minutes. As with part 1, it is packed with solid information that you can use going forward. It's very informative. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you very much for listening. Report. Today I am continuing my conversation with Maurice Gilbert, the CEO of Concilium Executive Search. We are in a multi-part podcast where we are exploring the hiring process, basically from A to Z. We talked in our last episode about what a company needs to do to get ready to bring on board a senior executive, chief compliance officer or other C-suite executive. And today we're going to visit about Maurice's thoughts on the sourcing of candidates and the presentation of the offers to candidates. So Maurice, thanks so much for taking the time to visit with us again. Welcome.
Thank you, Tom.
And what is the step around sourcing of the candidates? You gave us a little taste of that in our last episode, but I'd like to really explore that in more of a deep dive today.
You bet. Well, in our last conversation, we talked about developing the profile, and that's done in conjunction with the client in what we call a kickoff meeting that could last up to 2 hours. Now, the sourcing of the candidate, what we're going to talk about today, that's a function of, in part, we do ask our client in the kickoff meeting, are there any particular competitors that they wish us to source professionals out of? Are there any particular competitors or companies that are hands-off that they do not want us to recruit out of? So that conversation is done with the client in the kickoff meeting. Now, once we have those data points, then I take this back to my team and we develop a sourcing strategy. And by that I mean we have to make a determination as to where we're going to find the profile of the professional that we've developed. So the best thing to do here is to do an illustration. We were asked to do a search for a pharma company, and they had a facility in Ohio, and they wanted a compliance professional to be in Ohio. Well, that is problematic. Why? Because most of the pharma companies are in the Northeast Corridor, New York, New Jersey. And then you have a small cadre of companies in Chicago. So we thought, okay, this is Ohio. There are no pharma companies in Ohio. Where are we likely to get this professional? Well, it's very problematic to recruit an East Coast person to Ohio. or anywhere else for that matter. They're usually entrenched. Yeah, they're usually entrenched in the East Coast.
You can't even get me to go from Houston to Dallas, so that makes sense to me.
Exactly. So here's how we approached it. We thought, okay, we have to find somebody who has some roots in the Midwest. So the way we went about this is we thought, okay, well, we're going to be very aggressive in our marketing to people presently in Chicago, because that was the closest vicinity, and people that already understand the Midwest culture and are probably happy to be there. So we were very aggressive in trying to recruit people out of Chicago. But the other thing we did was, with our entire network of professionals that we're familiar with, we went back and we looked at people that may be on the East Coast or the West Coast, but maybe they went to university in the Midwest, or maybe they have family. That's where they started, and grew up in the Midwest. So we looked for professionals who had some touch point with the Midwest also, even if they may have been on either coast, let's say. So that was very, very strategic. And as it turns out, ultimately, we did recruit somebody out of Chicago. But we were also able to visit and have some very good dialogues with people, let's say, in New Jersey who went to school in Chicago or something like that, who were receptive to looking at this opportunity. So, again, you have to be very, very strategic to develop a sourcing plan, a strategy, let's say.
So after you've developed the plan and strategy, is that something that you communicate back to your client, or then do you try to field or take a look at potential candidates? Really, what's the next step for Consilium and you?
Okay. So once we develop the sourcing strategy with our team, we don't need to articulate that to the client. They don't care. They just want us to go out and get the right people to review. Mm-hmm. So once we develop our strategy, then we develop our selling points, what will be our presentation to a professional. And those selling points will include, among other things, we have to talk about the attractiveness of the location, the city. We have to talk about the attractive features of the company, of the opportunity, of the hiring authority, etc. So we develop, and even this takes hours of research to develop, attractive talking points to articulate the value proposition of this opportunity. So once we develop our presentation points, then we're ready to go to market and start our messaging. And here it's developed into basically two categories. We develop a target list of professionals that we believe will be a possible candidate. We don't know for sure, because every opportunity is different, and we don't know even if an individual is interested, but we develop what we believe to be a target pool of professionals. The second thing we do is we develop a pool of professionals that we know cannot be a possible candidate, but they could be a referral source for us. Mm. So we develop these two pools, and then we start our presentations, and we present it differently based upon if we're targeting somebody to be a candidate versus if we're targeting somebody to be a referral source. Those conversations, are a little bit different.
And at this point, when you're ready to make your presentation, or is the next step after you make your presentation, then taking potential, possible, or selected candidates to your client for consideration, or where do we go from here? Or where do you go from there, I should say?
Well, once we make the presentation, then we have, or the presentation of the opportunity is the first thing. But then as we're talking to the candidate, and here's where we get into our next module that you and I want to discuss is what's next? And what's next is now we have to screen the candidate to see if they're qualified and interested in the opportunity.
Well, let me stop you there because knowing you and your company, the folks that you work with typically are highly technically competent. There's not a people or a group of people in the Consilium world that are not technically competent. So how do you separate out a technically competent or from other skills that are needed for your clients?
Well, that's a great question because really what we have to get to the heart of is what does the client need at that particular point in time? And what I mean by that, again, this is best done in an illustration. We had a client who asked us to do a search in Europe, and it became apparent that the profile of what they were looking for is someone who was very fluent in investigations. They were having issues, and they were doing investigations throughout the EU, Russia, and even into China. So that was a focal point of what they needed at that given point in time. So when we were looking to screen professionals, that was top of mind. Were they very, very well versed in handling complex investigations and in those parts of the world? Because again, everything is there's a tremendous cultural influence, so to speak. So, did I address your question there?
Well, you gave us a great example of how you're able to take the information that the client provides you, have your gross or your large pool of technically competent potential candidates, and then you start the process of drilling down as to which candidate may be or is the most appropriate for this client in this situation. And you gave us a great example of the technical skill part, but I've heard you talk before, Maurice, and frankly, you always talk about the soft skills and developing. So when you talk to me, you say, Tom, we need to think about your soft skills. So my suspicion is that is, if not equally important, may even be more important for a lot of the positions that you're filling due to their C-suite level nature or at least high-profile nature in the company. And how do you evaluate a candidate's soft skills and then put that evaluation up against what the client may need?
Again, great question. Because here's a truism, and I think you've heard me say this before, as much as 80% of the hiring decision is not based on technical proficiency, but based on these soft skills. And because we represent and are filling very senior level positions, these include basically the ability to connect, the executive presence, these type of things. The ability also to recruit and to manage a staff. So a great component of our screening of professionals relates to these things. Do they have an executive presence, both physically and when they open their mouth? Do they have the ability to shape and influence others? Because that's what compliance officers do. They educate, they shape, they influence, and then, of course, they have to supervise a staff. And we ask questions about how do they go about recruiting staff and developing staff, things of this nature.
So after you take a look at the technically proficient candidates and then move to your analysis of the soft skills that a candidate may have or may be able to deliver to a specific client or situation, are there any other steps in the presentation to candidates that you go through?
Yeah, a very important step is we have to find out why they may consider the opportunity, what we call the hook. So what we ask a professional who we deem apparently qualified, both technically and with the soft skills, we ask this important question: why might you consider leaving your present employer? Or, asked differently, is there anything about your current position that may not continue to meet your career needs? Without that, there's nowhere to go. You don't know how to help them, in other words. But if they do identify, and there's usually something there because no opportunity is perfect, but once you identify what might be lacking, then that is, quote, the hook, and that's something that needs to be vetted throughout the interview process. So here's a case in point. We were vetting or actually screening one professional, and this was a senior director position, and the individual said, well, I'd like to gain more international exposure because that will help me eventually position myself to be a chief compliance officer. Well, as it turns out, that's what the opportunity was all about that we were searching for. It had an international component to it. And so therein was the hook. So you have to ask that question. It's very important because you have to know that what the client is looking for, and then and the candidate. So once we get that data point, we also have to articulate that to the client and make sure that they address that head on in the interview process. Make sense?
It does. It does. So it sounds like that you and Concilium go through a fairly lengthy internal process to not only evaluate potential candidates, but then actually interview potential candidates to determine really the right candidate for the right job for the right client. Is that a fair summation?
Sure, absolutely. Everything is very, very deliberate and very strategic. There's hours and hundreds of hours that go into a search because it's very complex. This is not something where you pick up the phone, you make a few phone calls, and boom, you have the individual who's going to be right for your client. That's way too simplistic. Each search averages about easily 250 to 300 hours because it's so intense what you have to go through. The volume of people you have to talk to, you have to screen to see if they're appropriate. And then, of course, there's other elements of the search that we're going to get into in some other modules. But this is very, very labor-intensive.
It sounds like you're describing almost a funnel process where obviously you start out with a large number of potential, and then you have to winnow that down and winnow that down, and you have to do it through really not only old-fashioned legwork, but a fairly detailed interview process after you have reviewed the written resume or other indicia of technical proficiency to come up with at least a list of potential candidates.
Absolutely, because no client wants to basically review more than 5 professionals. So it's our job to whittle that down and present the best of the best. That's when we're doing our job appropriately. It's not up to our clients to spend additional time. In other words, we don't present 15 professionals for an opportunity. That wouldn't be doing our job correctly. We have to present the best of the best, and we have to lessen the time that our clients are involved because they're busy. They're busy conducting business. It's our job to whittle down the best of the best and present them in a nice, short, succinct manner so that our clients could initiate the interview process.
So now that you've been able to synthesize the best of the best, is that the point you present the list to your client, or are there other steps before you get?
Once we're comfortable that we have a great short list, which would be no more than 5, then we will present these professionals for our clients' consideration and buy-in and commence the interview process, which I believe is going to be the subject of one of our follow-up modules.
It is, and frankly, that's probably a good stopping point because we are going to go into some fairly interesting and very important information on the interview process. So with that, I think we will end this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. We are continuing our conversation with Maurice Gilbert on the A to Z of hiring and compliance. So Maurice, thanks very much, and I look forward to continuing our conversation.
I as well, Tom. Thanks so much.
All right.
Take care.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. I have 2 calls to action for you. First, if you could go to iTunes and rate this podcast, I would greatly appreciate it. The second thing is, if you have any questions you'd like answered, I'm developing my next mailbag episode and would love to be able to answer your question in a podcast. So please send me any questions you might have that you'd like answered at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening.